To mark the 80th anniversary of the outbreak of the Second World War, the Royal Scots, Britain's oldest infantry regiment, has recorded the contribution of 4 of its surviving wartime veterans. Each served in a separate campaign and experienced the war in different ways, a reflection of the regiment's global contribution from 1939 to 1945. The 1st Battalion first saw action in France, suffering heavy losses defending the perimeter of Dunkirk in May 1940. After being reformed, the battalion fought in Burma from 1943 to 1945. Following the surrender of Hong Kong in 1941, the 2nd Battalion was likewise reformed and served in Gibraltar and Italy from 1942 until 1945. The 7th, 9th and 8th Battalions, the regiment's 2 territorial units, fought in northwest Europe following the invasion of Normandy in 1944. The regiment was awarded 39 battle honours during the Second World War. Around 10,000 men served as Royal Scots. Of these, 1,241 lost their lives, a higher proportion than in the First World War. 243 men from the 2nd Battalion alone died or were killed while prisoners of the Japanese. Despite their differing experiences, all 4 veterans see themselves first and foremost as Royal Scots, members of an extended family. Now, after the passing of years, the link between the regiment and these soldiers and their families has been renewed. Through their honesty, humanity and humour, these old royals offer younger generations an insight into an experience of war that is vivid, unique and tangible.
I got my calling up papers and they asked me, which unit do you want to belong to? Do you want to go into the RAF or the Navy? I said, no, I want to go into the Royal Scots because my brother was an officer in the 1st Battalion Royal Scots. I was 19 years of age when that happened.
How old was I when the war broke out? Was I 13? I was in the OTC at school, the Officers Training Corps, and then in 42 I joined the Westminster Scottish Cadet Corps, and I was very keen on that until I left it to join the army. I went up to Kincardineshire to join the 79th. So at that time, I suppose I must have been the youngest member of the battalion because I was only 17-something then.
My grandfather, father, and an uncle had all been Royal Scots. So I had continued the family connection. The trouble was that when I left Sandhurst, both battalions was abroad. So I went to the depot and waited until the 1st Battalion came home, and then I moved down to them in Aldershot or Camberley, etc.
We were all very military then, and I think young people were conscious of what had happened before. Remember that, was it 50 nights we had in London of continuous bombing in 1940? I used to cycle to work a different way every day because firemen would still be working on properties that had been bombed the night before. So we were all very conscious of how difficult life was at that time, long before entering the army.
I had 7 months training, and they came to the conclusion that I seemed to be officer material. I don't know why. So I ended up as a full lieutenant in 1942.
It was just before World War II, you know. In fact, in 1938, actually. And myself and a couple of my mates made up our mind to go and join the Terries. So I went down and joined the Dandy Nines. Billeted in Lauder just at the start of the war, you know. We were billeted with the local snab, who's the bootmaker, you know. And the local pub was just across the road, of course, you know. So it's just a matter of that, you know.
Also in the Octu in Isle of Man, when one of the officers said, "I'm sorry to tell you, but your brother has been killed in Burma." Well, I didn't know that he had transferred from the infantry to the carrier platoon, but all the members of the carrier platoon were all killed in one time. And my brother must have switched to the carrier platoon without telling me. I never knew that until later on. I could have been excused army service altogether on compassionate grounds, because my father was a widower and he was blind and he had a stroke and he had 3 boys in the forces and a daughter working in Edinburgh Castle. But I wouldn't have done that because I'm very patriotic. I wanted to fight for my country. When I got my calling up papers, then I was called up.
Where did I meet her? She was working with her father, who was a nurseryman, near where my parents lived, and they were very, very keen gardeners. And I remember this young girl coming with a barrow full of flowers for my mother. She was wearing a very nice skirt at the time, I remember. I said, "That's a very nice kilt you're wearing." She said, "Yes." I said, "What's the tartan?" She said, "I don't know." "Well, then you've no right to be wearing a kilt," I said. Had I been I would have had nothing more to do with this fella ever. So that was the beginning.
You always had 2 weeks embarkation leave just to say goodbye. But my father wasn't willing for me to go to the front line. So I pretended to him. I said, "I'm not going to the front line. I'm going to be stationed in Gibraltar. And if you want me, I could get from Gibraltar to Edinburgh in a matter of hours. So there's no danger. I won't get killed." And for the whole length of my army period, he thought I was stationed in Gibraltar with the 1st Battalion, the Royal Scots. He didn't know that I was sent to Italy, to the war zone.
Oh yes, came to the station, we kissed goodbye and that was it. Very difficult to come from Sussex to the first time to Inverness when you haven't been out of the area at all. I can remember being half asleep with a ghostly voice saying, "Ave Moo," before we got to Inverness. So I didn't meet her properly again until I came home on my first leave, which was some long time afterwards.
We knew we were going to go abroad. We're heading for the boat, you see, at the Shield docks. And it's left here for India. And it's a long road round, you know, round the bottom of Africa and up the other way, you know. That before we could go through the Suez. We got transferred up to the Calcutta, across to Calcutta, and from there up the road towards Imphal and that, you know, Burma.
Well, I was sent as an advance party, went across in a destroyer to France to find out where the battalion was going to go to. Well, of course, we were the first fighting troops to land in France. The regiment was shipped down to the west coast, and I had to find billets for them there. And when the transport arrived, we moved to the Paradis itself. And spent the winter digging holes.
Well, shortly after I joined, I was attached to the Royal Scots Fusiliers because the Royal Scots were still in Gibraltar. And then I was told by the company commander that he wanted me to go out on patrol, and which I had to do. And that's when I first encountered the enemy on patrol, but I wasn't frightened at all. I was walking along this little pathway in the Apennine Mountains with the platoon behind me, 30 young men, and I was in front. I always believed in being in the very front. And I turned the corner, and there in front of me were 2 Germans in a dugout, as far as I am from you. And they got the fright of their lives, as we did. I could have touched them. I told the men I should fix bayonets, just to frighten these men. And we got the fixed bayonets, and these 2 Germans were shaking visibly, frightened to death that we're going to kill them.
Putting myself in his shoes, I don't know how I would have reacted, or how I would have coped at that age, but I just respect Jack immensely for having been able to cope with such a huge task and burden on such young shoulders. You know, that generation is a very stoic bunch, but he has seen a lot.
We landed on Walcheren. I was 18 then, company runner. 3 of our companies assaulted the Britannia Hotel, and I was with A Company. We were scheduled to go up to Middelburg 2 or 3 days later. I went up with them. The headquarters tank was blown up, and we had a number of casualties in that, and we were left. Our company commander called the artillery down on us when we were already blown up. It was the most difficult time. A Dutchman came to save us with a boat, which was of great help. As I was the only one that could row, it was my job to ferry everybody back to some roofs of houses nearby, and we could occupy the the top levels. A Buffalo was left behind with the medics aboard, and the tank commander was killed, the Buffalo commander was killed, and we learnt subsequently the following day that one of our own people, Billy Whitworth, had been killed.
The French, they had built these forts down the frontier, but the Belgian border, there was only one, and that was on our right flank. And as I say, we spent the winter extending the defences up the Belgian frontier. If you remember, the Belgian army collapsed, and we moved in overnight to far side of Brussels, took up a position there, and there we stayed until the Germans arrived. We were all right, we managed to keep them off, but the Belgian army collapsed, so we had to withdraw back into France. We lost quite a lot of soldiers. The Norfolks, they were overrun, and a lot of them were murdered by the Germans.
The first campaign was on the Aragera Spur. The idea was to get in and get out. We fought down there, down that way, and we got down to Mongdo, you see. And that's when the Japs chased us back. We got outnumbered, you know. Fear was the main thing, you know. To me, it's a driving force, you know. That's what makes you do things that you don't want to do, you know. That's what I felt anyway. You know, when you're told to go into action, you didn't want to do it, but you did it. You made yourself do it, you know. Talk about heroes being brave, but to me, a hero was a guy that was scared stiff, but he had to do something. He felt he had to do something, and that's what he did, you know.
Fear becomes the operating factor for everybody. Your own way of trying to conquer it, and of course, not allowing other people to know that you're afraid. That is, again, a difficult thing to do. The principal thing for everybody was the difficulty of actual combat. Nobody can prepare you for that. And I'm afraid an army will only advance as quickly as the infantry take their objectives. If they don't do it, the army stays stationary. And that's a fact of life that every infantryman has to learn. So we had many, many weeks of going in the line and holding it until we went down, I think it was, to Heinsberg, and took Heinsberg. That was exceedingly difficult with a very long approach march. It had had an enormous bomber raid before the event, so there were these huge craters to navigate before we even got into the town. And then we came back to another very difficult place because 30 Corps had taken on the Battle of Cleve, hadn't they, the Reichswald Forest. And we were allocated the right flank at Gnep. The Germans were very good mortar people, and they had a weapon called the Nebelwerfer, which fired 5 or 6 barrels at a time. And to be dug in opposite the Castile on a visual flank or slope to the enemy, it's most unpleasant when the mortaring starts at one section of the slope. You can almost set your watch as to when you're going to get your packet, and that isn't very happy.
The second time, that was when we routed them, you know. That's when they got up to Kohima. When we got up there, the place was littered with them, dead bodies, you know. Young Japanese guys lying dead, you know. Not nice, so. No. Just thought, what a shame. That guy, he's got a family, you know, somewhere. And that's what used to go in my mind.
I'm pleased to hear my dad talk about the Japanese in a human way, that, you know, they were just young men. And I think that's really important. And I think it's important that we actually tell these stories to understand how difficult it must have been for people to actually go through the war at that time.
So we eventually finished that, and we were allowed back to Gnep, a section at a time, for baths, which we hadn't had for some time. You kept your battle dress, but you had new pants and vests and shirts and clean socks and what have you, and a proper bath, which was wonderful. And we were marching back as a section on the Gnep road towards the Bath unit, and somebody said to me, "Hey, Nobby, look what's coming." And coming towards us was a cortege of motorcyclists in white belts and cross belts, and behind them a jeep. So I ordered our band to march to attention and threw up a salute to the jeep as it went by, and to my horror it stopped. The jeep reversed, and sitting in the back with an ADC was General Horrocks, who'd been the Corps commander in charge of the whole Reichswald Forest battle. And I shall never forget it. I was terrified. He said, "Good morning, Corporal." I said, "Good morning, sir." He looked towards where we'd been and said, "That's been a very difficult job in there. Thank you." But he said, "Don't worry, Jerry's on the move now and he's pulling back. So tell me, how are your chaps off for cigarettes?" Bent down into the thing, and I stammered that we were all right, sir, thank you. "All right," he said, "well, the best of luck." And the point was, he stood and saluted us, which we responded. The motorcycles start off, and off he went again. So what Horrocks was visiting that day, I don't know, but he'd only just finished the battle. How on earth he could spend that time to tour where the people had been, I don't know, but it was an education of what the boss should do. We marched back to the bathing place. All the way back behind me there was the moan, "Don't you know why we didn't take the bloody cigarettes?"
That was the first campaign. The second one was on going down the Infall Road. That's where I got wounded, you know. When I got wounded, we were attacking the Japs at the time. I got hit twice, you know. 2 wounds in that leg. Once the and once behind the back of my leg here, you know. That's what I was dying. I was lying at the top of the hill, couldn't move. You know, I was scared to move because the Japs were still firing at us. You know. But 2 or 3 guys, but my own guys, that were down in the road, and I shouted, "Help!" you know, and he came up and dragged me down. And on the way down, my blood from my leg was floating up here. You see, I was covered in blood here. And when I got down to the bottom, onto the road, the 2 or 3 guys said, "Oh, he's been hit in the stomach," you know. I said, "No, I wasn't, it was in my legs." But once they got me down to the CCS, you know, a cattle clearance station, I got put in there, and during the night, it was freezing, you know, cold. And I was lying in a pool of water, or what I thought was water, but it wasn't, it was my blood, lying in a pool of my own blood. I shouted on the orderly, and I told him, I says, "I'm lying in a pool of water here and I'm freezing." And he looked, he didn't say anything, but he went away, brought the MO, and they took me away. And from there, I went down to Delhi Hospital.
He told us when he was wounded, he spent the first 5 minutes, before he was dragged down the hill, he spent the first 5 minutes trying to bury his head in a hole. He says, "I was digging a hole for my head." He says, because there was shells firing all round about me. I'd already been wounded. He says, "and if I can bury my head, when the shell hits me, I'll be recognised."
It was to get up there or wherever it was you were going, get there and get back. That was it, you know. You got told what to do and you did it.
We never knew about any terrible things that happened during the war. And I know him now, it must have been a terrible thing for him, you know, and for all these young guys, it must have been an awful thing. But as a child, we never knew about it.
I was told by Major Simpson, "You must not go out on reconnaissance." But when it came to the bit, I said to myself, how can I send a corporal out on reconnaissance when I'm an officer and paid to be an officer and sitting in the farmhouse with 12 men drinking tea? I said, I can't do that. So I disobeyed orders. I said, I'm going to go out on reconnaissance. And Corporal Fraser had to go because he was a full corporal. He had no choice. And then I had to choose one other person. And I just said, Private Borkwell. And of course, he had to obey me. So the 3 of us went out on patrol because I wanted to find out where this Calamella Tower was, whether the Germans were occupying it or not. And we got very near to Calamella Tower, very near to it until the Germans opened up with Spandau machine gun fire. And I was twice wounded, and Corporal Fraser got a bullet through the chest. But poor Private Balko panicked. He tried to run for it back to the farmhouse, but he was shot in the back. I was shot in my arm, and then I got a bullet wound in my thigh there. It was captured and sent to an Oflag, a prisoner of war camp, specially for officers. Life in the camp, if you behaved yourself, did nothing silly or stupid, they would just leave you alone. And I learned to behave myself, more or less. The only thing was they used to pass rumours around the camp that they were going to march all the prisoners out of the camp to some unknown destination and bump them all off. And whether these rumours were true or not, we didn't know. There was that air of uncertainty all the time, what the Germans were going to do with you. Not only that, but they didn't give you much food either. Hunger and uncertainty, they were the two things.
The daily routine as a prisoner of war, well, of course, you had to parade every morning when we were counted to make sure nobody escaped. It was very basic. I remember the doctors saying that the restricted diet would do us good later on, help us to live longer.
He was at the Paradis, and he was captured there, and he was then marched. I don't quite know how, but he said he was marched through Poland to a camp in Germany. I think he made some good friends at the camp. His mission was to escape. Obviously, that was what officers were asked to do. I was looking at some photographs of when he became a prisoner and when he arrived with lots of hair, and of course it all got shaved off. So when you really think about what it would be like, it must be awful, because people would have got ill and died and you had no freedom.
One fellow prisoner found an old drain pipe and put it over his shoulder and marched up to the gates of the camp. And the German guards thought he was a German plumber. Open the gates, and opened the gates. And the man marched away to safety, carrying this old rusty pipe over his shoulder, until he bumped into a patrol. And the patrol said, well, what's happening to you? And you're a prisoner, yes, so come on, get back to the camp. But he almost avoided capture.
I learned Arabic from an Arab officer who came to the camp. And I used to run around the camp, around the fence of the camp to keep fit. You had to be very careful not to fall over the tripwire around the fence, or they shot you. And then eventually they smuggled in radios, and somebody listened to the news and circulated it around the camp. That was about the only way we really knew what had happened. The Russians, when they approached the German guard, disappeared. I think they just went home. They just deserted us and left us to look after ourselves. We were rather worried what the Russians would do to us. I think they did provide us with food for a short time, before the RAF arrived to take us home.
The Germans were very tolerant, and I celebrated communion in the camp, and the Germans very kindly provided the wine for the communion service, but they stood at the door. They couldn't understand why we were drinking. Well, I didn't understand the meaning of communion, but it was my Christian faith, I think, that kept me going. But actually, I wanted my freedom. And when I saw the American Jeep coming towards the camp with a machine gun mounted towards the camp, I wondered just what the German guards in the lookout towers would do. Open the gates and let them in. And that's what they did. They ran down the stairs, and opened the gates, and let the American Jeeps come in. But most of them by that time had put on Red Cross armbands. They said, "We're not soldiers, we're medical staff." We said, "Oh no, don't tell a lie, we know who you are."
The liner Strathmore slides into harbour at Southampton. A boatload of men with but a single thought, home. Men wearing the crossed keys shoulder flash line the deck rails. The 2nd Division is back after 3.5 years' service in India and Burma. Many famous regiments are represented. The Royal Scots, Worcesters, Dorsets, Manchesters, Norfolks, the Durhams and the Camerons. They came back to bands, flags and speeches. And after 3 years of steaming jungle, even an English November day looks pretty good.
Well, we came through Cairo and down through the Suez, and that was a Strathmore. It was like a luxury liner. Bingo, and at that time it was housey. That's what we played every night. We arrived at Southampton at night. Nobody there. It was a steam mob, go off the boat, onto the train and back home. And that was it.
Everybody in the army survived on rumour. Hard information for everybody, even up to company level, is exceedingly difficult. And that's why if you've got any news at all, it's of extreme value. But I know, in spite of what books may say, at the end, we'd had enough. We wanted to see the end of the war because it was abundantly evident the enemy was collapsing.
We were flown home, actually, by RAF. They were flying troops in, and we were flown home in the empty aeroplanes. Yeah.
Granny, his mother, she didn't know that he'd been released from prison, and he just phoned them from Waverley Station to say he was back and could somebody send a car for him.
My father had been involved in the First World War. I don't think that it was just a thing that had to be done. There was nothing much to say, really.
I think people didn't talk about it, and I think partly because would we understand? So far removed from where we were, and maybe also there's always, if you have an accident or something and you're left alive and other people are being killed, you wonder why you've been, and maybe that for him, when so many of his friends have been shot and killed, that he'd come back and just had to get on with life as it was when he left it. Well, of course, a great deal has happened in between.
My dad came back from the war. He got a train from Portsmouth up to Edinburgh, got off at Edinburgh. So they were up the high street heading down to the grass markets they could get, and he heard my granny's footprints, or footsteps behind him.
He heard his mother's very distinctive footsteps behind him. And at the same time, my grandmother was thinking, I don't know what the world's coming to. Look at these soldiers, they're really scruffy, these two soldiers walking in front of me.
And I knew it was a mother. Without looking, I turned round, I said, "Hi, Ma." She said, "Oh," she said, "I wondered where the two scruffy soldiers were in front of me."
She wasn't aware, of course, that they had come from a boat from India and then the overnight train from Southampton and arrived in Edinburgh earlier that day.
But apparently my granny says he ran up the hill and grabbed me and cuddled me and whirled me round. And then she says, where are you going? He says, I'm going to the house. She says, well, you'll not get to the house that way. We're moved. We're moved.
I was claimed by 75 Graves Registration Unit with responsibility for 71 Graves Concentration Unit. And it was our job to tour Germany and Denmark, digging up bodies and reinterring them in a British military cemetery in Ohlsdorf. It's a big one. And this was a particularly difficult job. And you have to remember that most of the people we were dealing with were RAF, who had crashed at a particular site. And I suppose it should be said that they were buried with hatred. These people had only been bombing these folk minutes before they crashed. So most of the time we were picking stuff up in sacks. So if you go to Ohlsdorf Cemetery, you will see there are a great many unknown graves, because although we knew that the 7 people on board comprised these individuals, it was difficult to split them up. In a very short time, I'd seen a very great deal, as had everybody, but I think the last year was particularly unpleasant and particularly informing. So in that regard, I suppose I'd grown up very rapidly.
We never really had much of an understanding of what he'd been through. It was only, I think, the 2011, I think the 50th anniversary, we'd gone out to Walkeren. We had a chance with other members of the family, a little group of us, that really it started to sink in just what had happened. I mean, you hear things growing up, but that was when I really understood what he'd been through. Now that I'm older and I can talk to him and we go and we share these sorts of things, it really just does affirm how lucky we are.
Somebody mentioned earlier about the young today. I think it's difficult because the young today have never been terrified, have they? The young today have never been really frightened. But the whole of my generation had been, and you certainly learned from that.
My brother, he died in May 1942 in Burma, in Arakan. And they never found his body. He hasn't yet been buried. Because the last I heard of him was he was severely wounded and he was lying in the battlefield shouting for morphia. And some of his colleagues, his mates, ran back to get morphia to relieve the wound. And when they came back to administer the morphia, he disappeared. And so far we don't know what happened to him, whether the Japanese took him away for questioning. He intended to be a Church of Scotland minister. He's very, very religious. And that's why it's even more painful that he hasn't had a Christian burial at all.
Went home in, as I say, 46, whatever it was, and late 46. She changed, grown up, I suppose, and I had done the same, I'm sure. And then, as I said, that time, I asked her if she would marry me, and she said she would, and that was that. Because it's all over then. But I know where she was. There was, the Irish Guards were at Hobbs Barracks, and her mother was very friendly with the RSM and his wife. There were 2 divisions of Canadians there when I left, so there was plenty of opportunity. But as I said, she waited. But I know it was at that time, in 47, when my wife and I spotted for the first time in the in memoriam section Captain W.F. Thompson, date of death, 4th of November 44, with love from Dorothy. And my wife said it is not his wife, because she would have said so. It's either his sweetheart or his fiancée. And do you know that appeared in the Telegraph year after year for about 50 years afterwards? So not only was Captain Thompson killed on Walcheren, but he'd left behind a girl who had remembered him for that length of time. So it's not only the fallen that are important, it's the impact it has on those that are left behind.
If he hadn't been killed, he would have got married. He was engaged to a girl, and he would have had children, and I would have had the family, and I could have been enjoying their company now and grandchildren. So it is a big, big miss. Well, I would say that war is very an ugly experience, but sometimes it's necessary. I mean, I know that if we hadn't gone to war, it would be the swastika flag flying from the mast. So I was glad that we were victorious. But I didn't dwell on it. I forgot about the past and just concentrated on the future.
Funnily enough, I took him along to Remembrance Sunday at the church I go to. And there were some other soldiers there, a lot younger than Dada. And I introduced them to Dada, and he absolutely loved being together with old soldiers, really. So obviously, perhaps the worst memories have gone, and there's the camaraderie is something that's stayed.